now to Paul Ryan's weekly press conference where he is addressing the latest articles of impeachment brought against Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein.
Number one. Number two, I don't think that this rises to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors, a really high standard. Number three, we, since I got involved, have been getting a lot of compliance from DOJ on the document request. We do not have full compliance, and we have to get full compliance, but we've been making tremendous progress to that point. The second reason why I think that is not the right way to go is because knowing the Senate procedures and the rules over there, this is about as privileged as anything gets over there. It's one of the most privileged things that occurs in the Senate. And if this were to pass through the House, then what it would do is tie the Senate into knots. What does that mean to us practically speaking? That means it would derail or largely delay a big part of our agenda, our appropriation bills, our infrastructure bills, and it would clearly dramatically delay the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to go to the Supreme Court, which we expect to get done by October 1st when the Supreme Court reconvenes. So for many reasons, I don't think it's the right way to go. But we do expect compliance. We want to make sure that we get compliance, and we look at all the various tools we have available, including having the kinds of dialogues we've been having recently in order to get compliance from DOJ.
What are the specific documents related to the Mueller investigation?
Oh, well, so we have a process. We have a process with DOJ on that. We have a process with DOJ on the documents, and the special counsel gets involved when some documents might be in their purview and could compromise their investigation. Those documents do not come. So we have a process with DOJ to make sure that we deconflict any of these matters. Yeah.
So on that front, given what you just said, did you try to discourage your colleagues from taking this step? And do you view this as a legitimate effort or as a stunt?
Look, I think they know how I feel about this. We all want to make sure that we get compliance, and different members have different beliefs on how best to go achieve those goals. But we want to make sure that we get compliance from DOJ with our document requests. We've gotten a great deal of progress on the compliance, but we do not have full compliance, and we expect to get that.
One of those colleagues of yours.
Didn't you guys want to talk about the Better Off Now? You know, did I show you this?
Right after this question. You wrote it. One of your colleagues that brought those articles of impeachment, Jim Jordan, will announce shortly, we understand, that he's running for Speaker of the House. Has he shared those plans with you, and could you support Jim Jordan for Speaker?
I'm not going to be here. I support Kevin McCarthy. Everybody knows that, and I'm not going to be here, and he has not talked to me about that. Bonus.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday you addressed these interns and you asked them to rediscover their common humanity and treat other people with respect. I wanted to ask you, one of your colleagues in the House, Jason Lewis, there's been some reports about in his prior life before coming to Congress,
yeah.
a talk show.
Yeah, I was wondering where you were going with this.
He
Okay.
said some very, in some people's minds, disrespectful things about women and African Americans, saying the latter had an entitlement mentality, and that women, lamented that women couldn't be called certain words. Should he apologize for those comments?
Yeah, so, I've actually, whenever I drive around western Wisconsin, as I had in the past years, I'd turn on Minneapolis radio, and I remember Jason Lewis back in those days. He was a shock jock. That was his job at the time. I've seen some of these comments, and I obviously don't support those comments. But the Jason Lewis I know here, who's a congressman, is an extremely conscientious man, a very hardworking, a very effective member of Congress, who has been nothing but an exemplary congressman who represents his constituents well.
Would an apology help?
I'll leave it to him.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. When the House returns in September, there'll be just 19 days before the midterm election. How confident are you right now in election security and in the U.S. government's ability to protect itself from any potential Russian interference? And do you think there needs to be more done by Congress to protect the integrity of the election?
No, I believe, the appropriations process is something that's always ongoing. I do believe we have learned a great deal more about how Russia attempts to interfere with elections and meddles in elections. We've learned a great deal more on the cyber front on that. So I think we're far better prepared today than we were just a couple of years ago on that front. Number one. Number two, we got to make sure that we have the right kind of information sharing with states, with secretaries of states, and with anybody else that could see a cyber threat from Russia, including our allies, by the way, when they have their own elections. So I think we are far better prepared for this. That is part of the reason why we have these investigations. And there's always more we can do to learn and prepare ourselves for these things, because their threats evolve, their tactics change, and we have to always be vigilant to make sure that we guard against evolving threats and tactical changes from Russia, who tries to interfere with not just our democracy, but all democracies.
Last question.
Lindsay.
You met with the president yesterday, and I understand you guys talked about government funding. Do you feel, two questions on that. One, do you feel the president is willing to push the border wall fight until after the fiscal year, so you guys can get some appropriations bills enacted into law before the deadline? And also, you had said yesterday that defense was a priority. Is there a plan for ensuring defense gets through? It seems like on the Senate side, their strategy for that is adding labor HHS. Are you guys willing to do that here?
Well, first of all, Leader McConnell and I, like we always do, had a very productive meeting. We walked the president through our strategy for appropriations before the fiscal year. He agreed with our strategy. So we think we have a unified strategy to make sure that we can get as many appropriation bills done as possible. So we think we have a very good chance, unlike a handful of years in the past, we think we have a very good chance of getting a lot of these appropriation bills done and into law before the fiscal year deadline. There will be some bills that will not pass, that won't be ready or done by then, and we'll have to have a CR to bridge us over until later on. As far as the wall is concerned, we've gotten some wall funding already underway that is being funded, but I think it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, and the president's willing to be patient to make sure that we get what we need so that we can get that done, because border security is extremely important. I would note that the position between our two parties could not be starker. We are funding the wall. We are for securing the border, and the Democrats are for abolishing ICE. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. I think we have a very clear contrast on that. But we feel very good that we are on the same page and in sync with the administration and the president on getting as much appropriation bills done as possible, including funding our military on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Don't forget.
All right, so you've been listening to House Speaker Paul Ryan addressing the media. The Speaker unveiling, there's a little scramble there by reporters, the Speaker unveiling a plan to address what he called the gap between skills and jobs available in the United States. But the questions that he really was asked to answer, was this impeachment bill that has been put up by Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan, two members of the House Freedom Caucus, conservative members of the Republican Party in the Congress, who've put together these articles of impeachment. And Paul Ryan essentially saying he doesn't believe that, according to the Constitution, you will agree to impeach somebody if they've committed high crimes and misdemeanors.
Right.
Now, that is subjective, and it's never really been clearly defined.
We should specifically say the articles of impeachment were against Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General.
Yeah, the Attorney General, right. And so he says it doesn't rise to the level of
right. And there is some speculation as to whether or not this group of Republicans, 11 of them, did this more than anything to send a message, because the general feeling is that it's actually not going anywhere.
Right.
There's not going to be a general vote on this. It's not going to move on to the Senate. But it certainly sends a message to the Justice Department. They have been complaining that they have not been getting documents that they've been requesting from the Justice Department.
And yet Paul Ryan said that he's been
he's gotten a lot of them.
Yeah.
He would like to get more. And in fact, there have been thousands of documents handed over at this point, but it's also an ongoing investigation.
Yeah.
And so, you can't just hand over everything.
Right. And so the question, of course, becomes where does this go from here?
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't really have a chance in the House, then, and Nancy Cordes is going to join us in a moment to talk about this, she very pointedly asked the Speaker, is this a stunt then? All right. So we are going to toss to Nancy. Okay. So, Nancy, we were just referencing your question to the House Speaker there, which is the question that a lot of Americans have on their minds. If this is no chance of actually passing, then is it a stunt?
Right. It not only does it not have a chance of passing in the Senate, but it looks like the authors aren't even going to push to actually bring it up for a vote in the House. So essentially what they did was drop this bomb the day before the House adjourns for a 5-week recess and ensure that it sort of percolates there and that members of Congress get asked about it for the next 5 weeks when they're home in their own districts. And you heard the Speaker of the House very clearly say he does not think that this is the way to go. This has been something of some kind of frustration for Republican leaders because they say, look, this is overplaying our hand. Yes, we have gotten a lot of documents. Would we like to get more? Sure. But when you get out there and say that the Deputy Attorney General, who was named by the President of the United States, should be impeached, perhaps that goes too far. Now, what the authors of this resolution will say is that Rosenstein erred because he didn't assign a second special counsel to investigate the first investigation into Russian interference and specifically investigate the FBI's actions in conducting that investigation. That is not a view that is shared, however, by leadership. There hasn't been a huge hue and cry for a second special counsel. And so, basically what this does is ensure that when Republicans go home to campaign, to talk to their constituents, that among all of the other things that they'd like to talk about, jobs and the economy, that they're going to be asked about this as well.
Why didn't he say anything yesterday? We didn't hear anything from Mitch McConnell either. I mean, and as Paul Ryan's being asked these questions, he sort of jokingly said, "Oh, don't you want to, talk about something else?" Why has the Republican leadership been so resistant to criticizing, an event like this?
Well, first of all, it happened after hours, so it wasn't the kind of thing that the speaker would want to draw more attention to by issuing a big statement or going before cameras immediately after it happened. They'd like to sort of disassociate themselves from this push as much as possible. But he was pretty expansive when he was asked about it in this press conference, and he was very open about the fact that he simply doesn't think, as you pointed out, that there's anything that Rosenstein has done that meets the description of high crimes and misdemeanors. And when I asked him whether he had tried to dissuade his colleagues from taking this step, he said, well, they know how I feel. And it's been pretty clear how he feels for some time. But the Freedom Caucus, as we've seen time and again, has a mind of its own. And this is something that allies of the president have wanted to do, A, because it shows their loyalty, and B, because they think that it might give the president some juice to be able to fire Rosenstein on his own. Now, he's got a lot of people warning him not to take that step, warning him that it would only make things worse for him. But it is something that his allies have floated as a possibility.
We should point out, Nancy, you're referencing the President of the United States. He has landed in Dubuque, Iowa. So we're going to keep an eye. That's the box that our viewers are seeing on their screen right now. But, Nancy, I also want to ask you about, because Jim Jordan is one of these authors of the articles of impeachment, he has announced, and Paul Ryan sort of mentioned it at the podium there, that he is going to run for House Speaker. Given the level of, I mean, it's no secret that not every member of Congress who's a Republican agrees with the Freedom Caucus and some of the steps and tactics that they use. What are Jim Jordan's chances of becoming House Speaker should the Republicans maintain a majority in the House of Representatives?
His chances are low, and that's not because he doesn't have a lot of allies and supporters in the House, particularly from within the Freedom Caucus and the more conservative wing of the party, but because the rest of the party leadership has really lined up pretty squarely behind Kevin McCarthy of California as the next speaker and the Speaker of the House. Right now, Paul Ryan has also made it pretty clear who he supports. The problem for McCarthy, and this is why Jordan sees an opening, is that not all Republican members of Congress view him as sufficiently conservative. They see him as being more moderate, and he's taken steps to sort of show his conservative bona fides, but Jordan believes that he represents a very powerful wing of the party, and so running for Speaker, even if he's unsuccessful, certainly gets those views in the forefront. It shows that he may not be a member of leadership, but he's got a power base, and he can use that power to help him negotiate the next time an issue that he cares about comes up. But, leadership would prefer for this kind of thing not to happen, obviously, because instead of a smooth ascent to power, it means McCarthy needs to watch his right flank, may need to adjust what he says, and just kind of brings the leadership fight out in the open when they'd rather be showing how unified they are.
Nancy, before we let you go, as we watch the president working the crowd there in Iowa, something he enjoys doing, I want to ask you about a reaction on the Hill to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo appearing yesterday before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It struck me as I watched the entire proceedings that it's one of the rare times that you did see some criticism of the Trump administration of Secretary Pompeo from Republicans and Democrats alike. I get that Corker is leaving the Senate, but, we saw some very strong language that was used in addressing the Secretary of State when it came to President Trump's performance in Helsinki and, of course, around North Korea. What are you hearing in the hours and the aftermath of that performance yesterday?
I think people feel that this was legitimately a watershed moment. Yes, Corker has been critical of this president before. He's made no secret of that. Yes, he is retiring, but he is still the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he is a Republican. And he sat there face to face with the Secretary of State yesterday and asked him, why does the president do these things? Why does he say and do things that create mistrust among our allies and cause senators from the right and left to question his intentions? It's pretty remarkable. Try to think back to when President Obama, or really any president, was in office, and imagine a senator from their own party, the leader of a powerful committee, questioning their actions in such a basic way. Why does he do these things? And what the Secretary of State said, and it wasn't a great response, Democrats and Republicans acknowledged, was, well, don't pay attention to what he says, pay attention to U.S. policy. That's what sticks. And that was something that Corker really didn't buy. And other senators as well said, well, look, what he says gets listened to around the world. Our allies and adversaries alike hear what he says, and they plan accordingly. You can't separate policy from the president's utterances or his tweets. And so, there was this frustration that Pompeo was not able to answer the basic question that many of them had, which was, what exactly was said in that 2-hour meeting between the president and Vladimir Putin? What was promised in that meeting? They said, we're hearing a lot of things from the Kremlin. We're hearing a lot of things from the Russian media. We know we can't trust what we're hearing from them, but we're not hearing anything from you. And I think that they were surprised that Pompeo came prepared not even to give them some scraps, some new tidbits about what was discussed in that meeting. He really said right out of the gate, this was a private conversation. I know all about it, but I'm not at liberty to share what was discussed. And the president is entitled to have a private conversation with another foreign leader if he believes that that's going to be the best way to make progress.
Yeah, it struck us that the responses from the Secretary of State had a lot to do with, I've been briefed by the president, but he never really directly answered the question. Did you speak to the president specifically about the 2 hours that the president spent with Vladimir Putin? Did Vladimir Putin ask you to remove or ask the president of the United States to remove sanctions?
Right.
What about Ambassador McCall? There were all these questions, and he really never fully answered it. So you came away either thinking that he hadn't spoken to the president about specifics in that meeting, or taking him at his word that the president was entitled to have that meeting and he's been briefed on what was said.
Right. Right. You would think that the Secretary of State would want to clear that up, right, and leave no confusion about whether the President of the United States promised to weaken sanctions against Russia. The obvious answer would be, of course, he didn't promise to do that or suggest that he was going to do that without significant concessions from Russia in return. But he didn't say that. He just said that this was a private conversation. He said he is sure that he knows everything that was discussed because the president told him what was discussed discussed. But he said he hadn't talked to the only other American in the room, the U.S. interpreter, and that he wasn't at liberty to share any details of what the president might have promised or not promised or asked Vladimir Putin to do. And so these senators who take this role very seriously on the Foreign Relations Committee overseeing U.S. foreign policy, some of them felt that they weren't being given the basic tools to be able to do their job, and they are used to getting, if not all the information they want, at least some of the basics, and they were clearly frustrated that they hadn't gotten those basics.
All right, Nancy Cordes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.